The sky outside was awash in the soft hues of twilight, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Eleanor glanced at her reflection in the antique mirror, its ornate frame a stark contrast to the modern furniture. She straightened her dress, a simple black number for her solitary dinner. It was a Wednesday like any other, or so she thought. Eleanor ran a hand through her hair, smoothing down any stray strands. Her reflection mimicked her, but with a slight delay. She paused, holding her breath, her gaze fixed on the mirror. Her reflection remained motionless, a perfect imitation frozen in time. A shiver ran down her spine. She convinced herself it was just her imagination. The old mirror, a family heirloom, had always been peculiar. Its surface prone to clouding, the reflection often seemed dimmer. But tonight, it felt different, as if a cold presence had settled within its depths. Eleanor attempted to shake off the unsettling feeling. She turned away, her pulse quickening. It was ridiculous, she thought, to be spooked by her own reflection. It was just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. Dinner was a quiet affair. Eleanor found herself lost in thought, her unease from earlier resurfacing. The silence in her apartment, usually comforting, now seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old building. An unsettling awareness of the antique mirror in the next room crept into her thoughts. Unable to shake off the feeling of being watched, Eleanor decided to turn in early. As she passed by the mirror, she couldn't resist stealing another glance. This time, there was no mistaking the delay. Her reflection moved a full second behind her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Eleanor's composure. Her breath hitched in her throat and her heart pounded against her ribs. This was no trick of the light. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the mirror. Her reflection stared back with an eerie intensity, its eyes boring into hers with an unnerving familiarity. Eleanor watched in growing horror as her reflection began to act independently. It stretched, mimicking a yawn, even though Eleanor hadn't. The reflection then ran its tongue over its lips, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent chills down her spine. Panic welled up inside her. This wasn't possible. Reflections didn't yawn, they didn't move on their own, and they certainly didn't grin, not like that. The reflection's grin was predatory, revealing teeth a little too sharp, a little too long. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. But even as she denied it, a part of her knew, with chilling certainty, that this was all too real. The reflection was no longer a mere image. It had taken on a life of its own. The reflection's grin widened, and it slowly winked, a knowing glint in its eye. It was a gesture so unexpected, so utterly at odds with Eleanor's own demeanor, that she stumbled backward, knocking over a vase. The crash echoed in the silence, but her gaze remained fixed on the mirror. Eleanor watched, paralyzed with fear, as her reflection lifted its hand, its index finger slowly rising to its lips. It was a gesture she recognized, one she had used countless times before, but always in the privacy of her own thoughts. It was a gesture that represented her deepest, darkest secret. "How?" she breathed, the word escaping her lips like a gasp of pain. The reflection continued to hold the gesture, its eyes locked on hers, a silent accusation in their depths. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an unseen menace. Panic turned to ice in her veins. This was not just some eerie trick. The mirror, her reflection, it knew. It knew the secret she had guarded so fiercely, the secret that haunted her every waking moment. Eleanor took a step back, then another, her eyes never leaving the reflection. It moved with her, its movements fluid now, no longer the jerky, disjointed actions from before. It was as if it had learned, had adapted, and was now fully in control. Eleanor stumbled back until her back hit the wall, a cold sweat clinging to her skin. Her reflection mimicked her movements, its eyes never leaving hers. It was then she noticed something new, something that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. On the dusty surface of the mirror beneath the reflection, a single word was scrawled in what looked like ashes. It was a name that made her blood run cold. Daniel, a name she hadn't spoken in years, a name she had tried so desperately to forget. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. "Just stop it." But the reflection continued to stare back at her, the name in the dust a stark reminder of the past she had tried so hard to bury. The reflection tilted its head, a grotesque parody of concern. Then, slowly, deliberately, it reached out, its finger tracing the name Daniel on the dusty surface. Each movement sent shivers down her spine, each letter a nail hammered into the coffin of her sanity. A low hum emanated from the mirror, vibrating through the room and resonating deep within Eleanor's bones. Then came the whispering. It started faintly, like the rustling of leaves, but steadily grew louder, clearer. "He remembers," the whispers hissed, their tone laced with malice. "He remembers what you did." Eleanor felt a scream build in her chest, but she choked it back, her throat constricted with terror. Eleanor covered her ears, trying to block out the whispers, but they seemed to seep into her very being. They were the voices of her nightmares, given form in the reflection's mocking smile. Its movements were no longer an eerie imitation of her own, they were a cruel and twisted reenactment of her darkest secret. The reflection pointed at her, its expression a mask of accusation. It opened its mouth, and though no sound came out, Eleanor could hear its voice, cold and sharp, echoing in her mind. "Murderer!" it hissed, the word hanging in the air between them. Each accusation felt like a physical blow. The reflection was relentless, dredging up every detail of that fateful night, details she had tried to bury, details she had convinced herself were figments of a guilty conscience. The reflection began to pace, its movements agitated. It slammed its fist against the mirror's surface, the sound amplified and distorted, making Eleanor flinch. "It was you," it rasped, its voice a chilling whisper. "You did it!" Eleanor sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. The reflection was right. It was her. She had tried to forget, tried to bury the truth deep within herself, but the mirror, her own reflection, wouldn't let her. The room seemed to warp and twist around her, the boundaries between reality and the reflection blurring. She felt herself being pulled forward, drawn inexorably towards the mirror's surface. Her reflection reached out, its long, slender fingers brushing against the glass. The touch sent a jolt of fear through her, a visceral reaction to its unnatural coldness. She tried to pull back, but an invisible force held her captive. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. But the mirror continued to pull her closer, its surface rippling like water, ready to swallow her whole. The reflection was no longer a separate entity, it was her, and she was it. Her darkest fears, her deepest secrets were all embodied in that single terrifying image, and now it was dragging her down, into the depths of the mirror, into the abyss of her own guilt. As Eleanor's face met the cool surface of the mirror, the reflection's cold eyes seemed to burn into her soul. Images flashed before her eyes, fragments of memory, disjointed and terrifying. She saw Daniel, not as the monster she had painted him to be, but as he was, a kind, gentle soul. She saw herself, her face contorted in anger, her hand gripping a heavy candlestick. She saw the flash of metal, heard the sickening thud as the candlestick connected with his skull. The memories were vivid, undeniable, and they shattered the carefully constructed wall of denial she had built around herself. The truth was unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. She had loved Daniel, truly loved him, but her love had been possessive, all-consuming, and in a moment of blind rage, she had taken his life, silencing him forever. The reflection held her gaze, its eyes filled with a cold, knowing triumph. It had won. It had forced her to confront the truth. The reflection's grip on her loosened, and Eleanor stumbled back from the mirror, gasping for breath. The room was still, the only sound her own ragged breathing. The whispers had stopped, the accusations silenced. She stared at her reflection, no longer afraid, but filled with a chilling sense of resignation. The reflection stared back, its features softening, a flicker of something akin to sadness in its eyes. The name on the mirror, Daniel, remained. It was a constant reminder of her sin, a brand that would forever mark her soul. But there was also a strange sense of peace that came with the revelation. The truth, however horrifying, had set her free from the prison of her own lies. Eleanor knew she couldn't outrun her past. The reflection had shown her that. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live with it. The reflection, her darker self, had forced her to confront the darkness within, and in doing so, had perhaps shown her a path towards redemption. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the window, casting an ethereal glow across the room, Eleanor made a decision. She would turn herself in. She would confess to her crime, face the consequences of her actions. Leaving the mirror behind, Eleanor stepped out into the dawning day, the weight of her confession heavy on her heart. She didn't look back. A strange sense of calm had settled over her, not a peace born from forgiveness, but from acceptance.